All right, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. I really appreciate your time and you taking the time out to come talk about stuff and join me here. So, for the people that don't know you, break down who you are, what you do, and where you're at right now with everything.
Absolutely. So, my name is David Skolnik. I am a doctor of physical therapy, a strength and conditioning coach, and a powerlifting coach. I own a small business called Stronger in Motion, and I host a podcast called the Essential Strength Podcast. So, I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona. As a coach, I work out of a great little powerlifting gym here called American Raw Fitness, where I work with athletes, whether that be helping them prepare for a powerlifting meet or kind of taking a little bit more of like a rehab recovery clinical approach in the gym setting for folks who are, maybe fresh off of a competition and sort of feeling the wear and tear of a 12 or 15 week preparation, to squat, bench, and deadlift as much as they can, which is great for squatting, benching, and deadlifting, but pretty terrible for every other, area of life. So kind of helping people fix or address nagging aches, pains, mobility limitations, what have you, make them a little bit more human during their off season. And then as a clinician, I work primarily actually in geriatrics. So I work in skilled nursing, long-term care, which, due to the pandemic, everyone is much more familiar with those terms. So I work with mostly older and very compromised individuals, whether it's 85-year-old with a hip replacement or 55-year-old with a stroke, amputees and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of split my time between a gym setting and a sort of acute care inpatient settings.
Wow, yeah, you're all over the place. You got such a broad range of people you work with, it sounds like, but the underlying theme across all of them is like making them stronger in different capacities, right? In some degree.
Yeah, it can be very, very different. One person in the morning at the clinic might need to just get strong enough that they can start to roll over in bed
Mm,
by themselves again for the first time in weeks if they've been in the hospital for months. And then that same evening, I might be helping someone try and figure out, how do they go from deadlifting 525 pounds to 565 pounds in the next 10 weeks.
yeah, man, that's super crazy. Really on both extremes right there. But one thing you mentioned, which I'm sure ties into both of these, right, is helping people rehab and go through injuries, right? So obviously you can't be stronger if you can't use your body properly. So when you go through this, whether it's general population or with the athletes that you work with, what injuries do you usually see come up most often that hold them back from becoming stronger or from just moving properly and safely?
So I think the most common areas of limitation or sort of nagging, persistent pain are hips, that sort of low back, or what a lot of people would call SI. It's not right on your spine. It's a little bit off to the side, kind of right where your hip and your back start to meet. With power lifters, there is often some element of kind of shoulder or upper trap type of stuff, and that's also pretty common. You hear a lot of people talking about how they hold their tension in their upper traps. So I would say neck, back, hip are probably the areas that are most commonly limited or causing people to say, this just doesn't feel quite right, even if it's not painful. Just something's not right.
Mhm. Nice. Okay. Yeah, I definitely see that a lot in people I coach as well. I'm sure like most people can relate to low back pain or shoulder pain to some degree, especially in the world we live in right now. But when you say like something doesn't feel quite right, what identifying factors do you kind of go through, especially for someone that maybe has had a long underlying injury that they've just kind of fought through this entire time and doesn't know what feeling right actually is like? What do you look for when you assess that person to get to the bottom of this and see what's actually going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I won't necessarily go through like physical therapy examination type of
Mhm.
stuff, but I think what's really important to realize is it's more of like an interview process, almost trying to figure out, first of all, what does the person think is going on? And most often they have a pretty solid idea because, they obviously live in their own body, they experience all their own habits, and they can typically kind of point out where they think it originated, what seems to make it worse, what seems to make it better. But then it's that last 10 to 15% of, I've got this somewhat under control, but I'm just kind of sick of it still nagging and being there, and I'd like it to just go away altogether. I think for most people, what it comes down to is determining what their most common activities and positions involve. Whether it's someone who drives a lot for their job, someone who sits a lot, someone who's on their feet a lot, regardless, typically there's sort of a most common position that a body is in. And then from that position, there's a lot of little repetitive movements, right? So, is it the fact that their computer monitor is like a little bit off to their left, and it's been a little bit off to their left for the last 5 years? And their question is like, why can't I turn my head as far to the right?
Hmm.
And that can be kind of like that light bulb moment, like, oh crap, like for instance, most people have that I've found, most people have more internal rotation in their right hip because everyone drives with their right foot. So you're constantly rotating your hip in and out to go from gas to brake. And then the left leg is usually just kind of stuck in this fixed flexed position. So people, when you watch them squat, their left knee will push out because they don't have the internal rotation to get to depth in more of a sort of, quote unquote neutral stance, or they'll toe out more on the left because they got to get out of the way of their pelvis on the way down. And everyone who's right-handed uses a mouse with their right hand, or the TV in their living room has been in the same position relative to the couch, and they have their spot on the couch, and that's where they watch TV. So it's sort of teasing out, what are your most common positions, and then from those positions, what are you doing from an activity standpoint most of the time? If you're looking at people who go to the gym, what's your routine? How long has that been your routine? When was the last time you did something different? And most of the time, my job is just kind of getting them to do a handful of things that they don't normally do, that sort of work them out of their really, really habitual positions and movements. And that sort of starts the process of undoing this little tightness or restriction or whatever it is that I'm trying to get at.
Nice. Okay. So it sounds like, you called it an interview, but you're basically playing detective, right? Seeing what they're doing on a regular basis and then tying that with how they're describing their pain to come to the bottom of this. And then essentially kind of going with the opposite of what they're doing, right? Putting them in what's the word? Antagonistic positions, right? Like,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
using those things. So when you do that, then do you design person's program to be like entirely antagonistic, or is it kind of a balance of both? Where do you kind of fall with that?
So, I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that like anything can be functional as long as it is in alignment with that individual's goals. So let's talk about a power lifter, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to have a lot of clients stick around if I say you don't get to squat, bench, or deadlift for the next 6 months, because we have to do, only 5K running, upright rows, and what's another good example? Spin bike, because those are things you don't do. It's more like, can I get you to add something into your warm up, add something into your cool down for a power lifter? So, and again, a power lifter, most people who power lift are not professionals, right? They're not making any money. It's just a passion. But it gives them more direction than a person who just goes into, your standard neighborhood gym and does a machine circuit, for instance. It's not better or worse. It's more intentional, perhaps. And so what I'm trying to do is get them to kind of buy in to this idea that if we can change up maybe 10 to 20% of your standard routine, that will give you a chance to feel better, move better, recover more, kind of be, again, like I said earlier, kind of just be like a human being moving in the way that we were meant to.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that then improves your performance. Or the other way that I end up talking to people a lot is, again, most people are not professional athletes. The more that your physical performance dictates your lifestyle, right, your income, all this other stuff, then the more you do have to say, like, look, I know that I was just talking about this with someone this morning. Like, being a professional football player is not good for longevity, right? But
Yeah, that'll tear you apart.
if you're making $50 million over 10 years to play football, I'm not telling you that you should stop because you need to do like yoga, you need to walk more, you need to stop lifting so heavy and running into people, right? This is your livelihood. Same thing with like a violinist, right? If you're a professional violinist, I'm not going to tell you sitting is bad. Like, you better fucking sit down or else they're going to kick you out of the symphony. And so it's trying to find and explain to people, and again, those are the outliers. Most people would do better with variety.
Mm-hmm.
Most
So,
people who work out would do better, kind of training in, these 6 weeks, we're going to work on strength. The next 6 weeks, we're going to work on endurance. The next 4 weeks, we're going to work on power, and having this continuous sort of variety in their movement and their training. And I think that would solve a lot of issues with like chronic discomfort and pain.
so it's not then removing these positions that cause them pain, but just including more of the ones that are going to help alleviate that pain.
Yeah. So it's, if you usually squat and then you do deadlifts, like, could we throw in something single leg? Right? Could I have you move laterally, even for just one movement twice a week? You're used to doing a goblet squat. Let's just change that to a goblet lateral lunge for the next 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, all right. So I like the sound of that. Now, but now let's say, for instance, you're working with this power lifter, it's off season, and whenever they do deadlift, whenever they do overhead press or bench, they have really, you know, I don't want to say aggressive, but like a very significant pain in their hip,
Sure.
in their knee, in their shoulder. Now, you obviously at some point you want them to power lift and do those things because they're going to be competing, or they love doing it. But right now, maybe that's doing more harm than good. What kind of approach would you go there in order to help them, continue to work toward their goal of lifting more, but not, regress in pain, regress or make their injury worse? What's the approach with that?
Yeah. So the approach I take with that is kind of informed by two people in particular. I've learned from John Flagg, who's part of the clinical athlete group. He does the clinical athlete powerlifting certification, and then also the barbell rehab. Dr. Michael Mash, he's a physical therapist. I just finished his online course a couple days ago. As we sit here and record this, and he's coming out to Phoenix in March, so I'm going to be taking his in-person course. I'm stoked. But really what it comes down to is helping those powerlifting athletes understand that there are so many ways to improve their performance outside of simply just their competition deadlift, squat, and bench press lifts, right? So it's about figuring out what's the closest we can be to your competition lift without pain. And so that's like, well, let's talk about, so like you said, a deadlift, that could be, can you even lift a PVC pipe through your full deadlift range of motion? Or is it literally the movement, that bending over and picking something up? It could be a piece of paper, and that's painful. Or is it that once you cross 80% of your 1 rep max, that's when it starts to get acutely painful? So that person who can't pick up a PVC pipe, that's going to be a longer process of determining, is it that you're just not stabilizing and bracing properly from the bottom position? Is it that you've got some really, really irritable and inflamed tissue in, maybe it's in your lumbar spine, musculature that just, as long as you keep poking, like kind of poking the bear, so to speak, it's going to keep growling at you. Like, you just need to leave it alone. And for that person who can't even pick up a PVC pipe, it's like, okay, we need to just not put you in that position for 4 to 6 weeks, because that's how long it takes tissue to heal. Mm. I've got an athlete like that right now. She had low back pain for almost a year. And she just kind of kept trying. It's like, maybe this week it'll feel a little better. Maybe if we take this much more weight off, it'll feel a little better. But she literally couldn't pick up her water bottle without, squatting to do it rather than hinging. But she could squat 275 for reps, no pain. She could bench all she wanted, no pain. She could do lunges, no pain. She could sumo deadlift, we figured out, no pain. So we're going to keep doing all those things and just not conventional deadlifting. So it's trying to figure out how much intensity, how much load can you tolerate from what position. And we're going to do everything you can tolerate and just avoid what you can't, and helping them understand, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 is what it's going to take for those tissues to heal. And long term, if you're 22 years old and you plan on competing in powerlifting, 6 weeks is really not that long. It's really, you might honestly be stronger if we just stop deadlifting and you work on, a Hatfield squat or a Bulgarian split squat and do these things that you've never even tried before. We'll get your one rep split squat way up in 6 weeks, and you'll go back and your back will feel fantastic and you'll deadlift more than you ever did before. So that's been a really cool thing to learn through the process with both barbell rehab and clinical athlete. Someone who has pain with a bench press, do they need to literally start by doing, elevated push-ups where you put a bar in a rack and you're at 45-degree angle, and that's the most they can do without pain? Or do you literally just need to keep them below 75% of their max and they can do full range of motion, no pain? If that's the case, having them do push-ups is a waste of time. Have them work at 70% for volume. But if they can't do, but some people need to be at that push-up.
Mm-hmm. So it's really individual at that point, basically, on the severity of the injury for like where you start, because you want to take them, you want to meet them where they're at as much as possible before building, instead of starting completely from square one, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's not cookie cutter. Like I said, again, sticking with that bench press example, someone who can bench press from from an arched setup, they can get everything great. And as long as they stay under 75%, they have zero pain, and they can dumbbell press with zero pain. It is then, in that process, hopefully with my eyes, I'm seeing something that I think is tipping me off to why they are having the limitation they're having. But taking that person who's functioning at basically 90% and taking them all the way back to square one would be doing them a disservice.
Got you. That makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned something where you watch them do the thing and you're looking for an indicator, something to tip you off about something that's not working the way it should, some sort of imbalance that's actually happening, the source of all the pain, right? But are there times where there maybe isn't pain in the movement, but you recognize something that isn't where it should be? How do you kind of work with that instead? Do you feel like that leads to more pain, or is it kind of like, I know some people say that the human body is super adaptive and they'll be put in these positions and they'll be okay, but where do you stand on that thought process?
Sure. So I like the idea of being a movement optimist. I think that's a Greg Lehman term. He's a physio. He's a pain specialist in Canada. So, I would agree that most people, you don't necessarily want to force someone to do something in a way that they're not used to, because that is probably more likely to injure them, right? If someone's always picked something up in a particular, okay, so like you're a coach, you're a trainer, right? You picking something up off the floor. They've always picked up a box, or they've always done whatever they do. They've always picked up their groceries this certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, hey, I want you to change the way you do that, but I want you to pick up the same amount of groceries.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's probably going to hurt them, not help them.
Right.
So now that's not to say that there aren't maybe better ways to move in general terms. So in
Mm-hmm.
the gym, yeah, I would agree that if someone is performing any lift with something that's just kind of like glaringly, like my alarm bells just start going off, like, holy crap, that's not like you're squatting and you're literally, your toes are facing each other,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's, I don't know how you're doing it. You don't have pain right now, but I don't think that's going to be great for performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if I'm working with someone who's just trying to get better, let's say they're trying to build muscle or they're trying to get stronger or whatever, then I think you kind of start picking apart and trying to get their movement patterns to be more optimal.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think it's very, very individualized. If someone's goal is to get as strong as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and they read something about how doing slow eccentrics is great for building muscle, then it'd be worth having a conversation about how building muscle and building strength are not necessarily the same thing. They come together, but if you want to get super strong and super fast, doing everything with a super slow eccentric extended load is not the best way to use your time. You need to be moving really fast. If you want to get fast, you got to move fast. But if you're trying to look like a bodybuilder, doing 3 sets of 2 squats is not the best way to build, like, bodybuilding quads. Then you need 5 sets of 20 with like 5 count eccentrics. Like, you need to be crying on the leg press. So that again, and I think this comes primarily from, well, in large part from the fact that I went through PT school and I'm a clinician. Like, it's very patient centric. The
Mm-hmm.
same, you could have 10 people who all have a knee replacement, same surgeon, same age, same gender. Those rehabs could be completely different.
Wow. It's actually crazy to think about. But
Yeah, some people scar. Some people's bodies lay down scar tissue really fast. Some people don't.
mm,
Some people, they just have a ton of pain. And other people are like, so I went and played 9 holes of golf. Like, was that okay? My knee felt fine. Like, what? Yeah, okay, great. And then the other person's like, God damn it. I literally can't get off the couch without a walker. And we
mhm.
had the surgery on the same day with the same surgeon. So it's pretty wild.
Man, that's really wild, actually. But again, testament to how different the human body is from person to person, what it's capable of, despite maybe experiencing the same thing. But on that note, now, so like, you know, would is pain usually your main indicator for an injury, or do you look for other things that aren't related? So like, how can I say this? So for instance, a lot of people will have like knee pain, right? But then the issue isn't necessarily the actual knee itself. So then how do you go about finding the root cause of that, or breaking that down further, looking for the actual thing that's causing the pain as opposed to the thing that might
Sure.
be in pain or isn't in pain?
Well, so I think, the first thing would be, was there an event that the person can pinpoint? Like, if someone says my knee hurts, and I say, when did that start? Like, when I got hit by a car. It's like, well, yeah, I think we figured out why your knee hurts. Someone
Right.
backed into your knee. But if they're like, well, it started hurting, 3 months ago, it doesn't have to be as dramatic as a car. It
Hmm.
could be they slipped. They slipped and fell, and their knee kind of folded underneath them, and ever since their knee's hurting. Versus someone who's like, yeah, my knee, I started running 6 months ago. I'd never really run very much before. I decided to train for a 10K. It felt fine for the first 2 months. And then I started getting this kind of nagging pain in the front of my knee, under my kneecap. And now, I can't run more than 3 miles without my knee hurting. That's more complicated. That's doesn't have to do with the mechanics of how you run, where your foot hits the ground. Doesn't have to do with the fact that you don't have very good control of like knee varus and valgus. So when you land, your knee comes in a little bit over and over and over, and now the lateral part of your knee hurts. And then I start thinking, well, maybe it's because your IT band is kind of pulling on the tissue that connects it to your knee joint, over 1,000 steps every single time you land. And after 800 steps at 3 miles, now it's starting to hurt. Injury and pain are not synonymous. You can have pain without any sort of injury. And I guess you can have an injury without any pain. That's not as common. But you can have pain or sort of dysfunction without any sort of distinct event that caused it. But that's step one. Was there an event that you can pinpoint, this happened and then I started hurting in this area? Or is it more, the technical term is idiopathic. So idiopathic pain has no origin.
Okay. And then at that point, you break down how they're moving and see that if the repetition of this movement is leading to that pain. So I guess a common one would be like wrist or elbow injuries with bench pressing, right? Someone might suddenly just feel that on a random bench press day, right? It's not necessarily they hit their arm on something or anything like that. It's just this day they maybe added 5 pounds and then it just started bothering them, and then it sticks around for weeks at a time. That at that point it becomes more like, let me see how you're bench pressing and we can work from there.
Yeah, let me see how you're bench pressing, and maybe it's, there's a couple things we can change right away. Maybe you thought you're supposed to grip the bar super, super wide and aim really high up on your chest. That's going to be a very stressful position for your elbows to be in. So maybe we move your hands in a little bit and say, hey, I want you to kind of aim right kind of at nipple line, basically. If you're powerlifting, that's a common cue. And suddenly they can bench that same weight, pain-free. And that's like the magic of movement analysis, where you get to be like the wizard. How did you do that? But it's not always that simple. Maybe it's that your grip strength and your rotator cuff strength has been behind, the stability of your elbow and your pec. And it took you had to get strong enough for that to be exposed. The straw that broke the camel's back scenario. Everything felt fine till you hit 225, right? And then all of a sudden, your elbow started hurting, and that's probably because your elbow and all the ligaments and everything that's connecting above and below your elbow has been kind of overworked. It's been able to compensate for those mobile wrist and shoulder joints up until a certain load, and now it can't anymore.
So basically, the elbow has been acting, taking the role of a shoulder or a wrist in a way, because it's making up for what the other joints can't do.
It's been working overtime because that one guy keeps going home at 6 after 6 hours or whatever. And you're like, I can't keep working 10 hours a day. I'm burnt out.
Okay. And then, so now in that scenario, when you design a training program, when you work around this, do you add exercises for those, immobile parts to remove that? Or do you kind of work directly at that joint, in the recovery stages? So post workout, are you kind of working on pails and rails to help the opposite end of the elbow get better? What's your approach?
So similar to the deadlift scenario we were talking about, typically my first approach is going to be to just talk to the person about how nothing's going to get better if you just keep poking it. So we probably need to remove the irritating exercise or position, for a little bit of time, 4 to 6 weeks. That's one of those universal, the body heals in 4 to 6 weeks unless you've got some sort of underlying pathology happening that's delaying your healing.
Right.
And then in that time, then that gives me 4 to 6 weeks to tease out and further investigate, what is it that I think is limiting you in that bench press? Is it the fact that your external rotation is actually significantly weaker, maybe than you ever realized, and so your elbow, as you start to press, your elbows just flare early because you can't keep them pinned into your lats, basically. And all of a sudden you flare up like this on one side, and all of a sudden that's changed everything in your rotator cuff. Right here to here is a big difference. So then I'm trying to figure out, where are you? I like the term energy leaks. Where are you leaking energy? Right,
Mm.
your pec is super strong. Your bicep and tricep are super strong, but the shoulder joint itself is not dynamically stable enough for those strong areas to really express themselves. It's the running on sand versus running on pavement
Mhm.
analogy. You can be super fast on concrete, but you're not going to be as fast on sand. So until you change the surface, you're still going to be slow.
Okay. And so then, as something that's come up a few times now, is sounds like there needs to be a certain degree of stability for all the major moving joints established before you can move up in lifting a load, right? And do you like, there's a lot of different ways that I've seen people approach this, particularly PTs, not trying to call out your profession or anything, but like they'll be using like Bosu balls, stability balls, and they'll be doing push-ups on them, and they claim like that works, helps improve shoulder wrist stability, or they do squats on those things, help improve hip ankle stability. What is there any specific stability working exercise that you try to use for these scenarios, or is it kind of more of a it'll happen as we go through this program?
Um, pick a joint for me to talk
Let's
about.
say shoulder. Keep going off of that.
Shoulder.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So um, I will work on. So I'll be more general. So
Okay.
generally, like working on something like a serratus, like serratus punches. You know, I get so there are some things that apply to most people.
Okay.
Most people, especially nowadays, right? Most people sit quite a bit. So most people have some limitations in their thoracic extension, which then changes your scapular position. And when your scapular and thoracic positions change, then the normal mechanics of your shoulder change.
Mm.
So for someone who's having shoulder pain on a bench press, one thing that goes along with just not bench pressing in the painful range or with the painful load for 4 to 6 weeks is trying to use that time to improve their sort of functional anatomy. Can we get you to open up your chest a little bit more, to work on getting your shoulder blades in a slightly better position so that over those next 6 weeks, you're not also irritating your rotator cuff because you're rolled forward and every time you grab a coffee cup in the morning, right, your shoulder blade can't really move. And you're kind of bumping into those rotator cuff or bicep tendon muscles. Um, so it's not necessarily that I have a tool like a Bosu ball that I'm going to give everyone. It's going to be trying to get them in a little bit better position anatomically to utilize their muscles and have joint that most all your big moving joints, particularly your hip and your shoulder, function the best when the areas above and below are also moving properly.
Mhm.
So if you think about the pelvis, if you're kind of stuck in a tilted pelvic position, that is going to change the range that your hip has available to it. But yeah, I am gonna. I like some of that dynamic stuff, like a Bosu ball, or if you've ever seen someone do a chaos push up, where
Okay.
you have like a really thick band set up in a squat rack, and then you've got your hands on the band, like an earthquake push up. You're just shaking all over the place, or you'll see people, bench pressing with kettlebells hanging off of resistance bands. So it gives you all this extra movement that really forces you to stabilize. I think some of that stuff is great actually as accessories. It's really good.
Nice. So that's basically you're saying using those things on an unstable surface or an unstable environment helps create more stability in your shoulder, creates that
Mm-hmm.
foundation, and that translates really well to all the major movement patterns. One thing I always see and I like to use is like the bottoms up kettlebell presses, slower
Sure.
movement, just as shaky in a lot of cases as the, chaos push up. But
Mm-hmm.
you're saying kind of slow things down, find an unstable surface, maybe not even have too much of a load with it, and work through that motion like you normally would with like a pressing movement and
Yeah.
create that stability, right?
Yeah. And it's kind of prioritizing things.
Mhm.
You know, is a chaos push-up going to give you the same return on investment as spending 10 minutes just literally laying over a foam roller and trying to get your pecs to stretch so that they're not pulling you forward and closing down the anterior shoulder where your bicep tendon and some of your internal rotators are, and those are the things that hurt when you bench press. You know, I'd literally rather have someone go home and watch TV and lay on a foam roller for 15 minutes with, you know, with a pillow under their head. That's going to do more over the course of 4 to 6 weeks than any sort of, you know, Bosu ball exercise. And then once they've got that habit down and I'm starting to see a little bit of change, like they're just standing up a little straighter, their shoulders are back a little bit. It's like, okay, now we can start working on bottoms up kettlebell presses and, you know, planks where you're trying to do like a hand release plank or a plank with your hand on something unstable. And I'm not just making you strong in the kind of shitty position you're already stuck in.
Yeah. So changing how they use all their joints in unison and then going back to the original problem and working through that.
Yeah. You don't necessarily want to start reloading a structure that is still kind of stuck in that position that is faulty.
Yeah, I hear that. Makes sense. And then now when we say these things like going into once you've gone through, laid on the foam roller for 4 weeks, you feel good, you have a good position, and you're ready to work on stability.
Not 4 weeks straight. You got to get off the foam roller at least an hour a day so you can like eat.
Yeah, you know,
24 hours a day, foam roller. 4 weeks.
Non-stop.
You'll be fine. Everything will be better. You're going to lose a lot of weight. And your job. You'll lose your job.
You replace everything with foam rollers around the house. The bed, foam roller now.
Yeah.
You know, all of it.
Passive foam rolling.
Oh man, that would be something. Oh, but once you get to that point,
that, dude.
Yeah, hey,
$1 million idea.
Forever
the
foam
roller fix. Boom.
Now, but once you get through the foam roller fix, you know, you're on that plan for a little bit and you're ready to work on specific stability. Where do you incorporate that in a plan? Is that like your warm up? Is that your cool down? Do you use that intra workout like between sets and stuff? Where do you find it most
something
valuable?
Like the foam roller, like continuing to incorporate that tool?
Yeah, that or the, you know, like the chaos push up and the bottoms up kettlebell. Like where do you incorporate that into a plan when they're ready to use that?
I tend to think that you can probably pick 2 or 3 sort of, you know, rehab quote unquote exercises to continue as a warm up. You know, it doesn't need to extend your warm up to 30 minutes because you've got your whole rehab exercise plan. But usually, you know, 2 or 3 of those things built into a warm up are really, really functional. And then the sort of, if it's more, and that's primarily for, you know, muscle activation type stuff, like dynamic stuff. And then if, you know, if I'm thinking this person's, you know, if your goal is to get back to bench pressing and chest pressing, you are then kind of setting yourself up to have tight pecs, forward rolled posture, all this stuff, which is fantastic for bench pressing. You know, like you're going to become a better power lifter as you develop more and more upper body musculature and your body adapts to that lift, which is your competition lift, right? I don't want someone who's squatting 700 pounds to move like a yoga instructor. That would set them up for injury, right? I want them to have maybe 5 to 10% leeway outside of that like piston looking squat. You want them to be somewhat rigid. You know, a perfect example is like a sprinter, like an Olympic sprinter. They're not going to be very flexible because they're extremely powerful. And the opposite would be, you know, if you're going to be a, you know, an aerial acrobatic artist or something like that in the circus, you're not going to want to be super muscle bound and tight. But yeah, so I think understanding that, you know, what else does that person need to do in their day-to-day life, and giving them, you know, a couple options. Again, going back to the bench press, like it wouldn't be bad to continue, you know, 5 to 10 minutes per night before you go to bed. Just like relax on that foam roller and try and undo a little bit of that bench pressing plus your 8-hour desk job.
No, that makes sense. I mean, using the sprinter analogy, I really like that because um, for sprinters, especially if you're like a 100-meter dash kind of person, you need all your energy in just one direction. You can't be swaying left and right. You got to really be pushing in that direction. And if you want to be optimal as a sprinter, that's how your body's gonna, work toward, right?
Sure. And you can, I mean, you can just keep paring those examples down, right?
Hmm.
Like it's good to have aerobic endurance, but you're not going to be a world-class sprinter and a world-class marathon runner.
Right. So
You're going to be average, maybe
yeah.
at both.
Yeah. So it's like knowing what you want and what you want to accomplish, and then like kind of doubling down on that essentially, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's another perfect example like of how to work with clients.
Mhm.
Why are they doing what they're doing?
Yeah.
Do they understand why they're doing what they're doing? Or are they literally
Mhm.
just going to the gym because someone said you should go to the gym and they've been following a plan their buddy showed them 10 years ago, ever since?
Mhm. Right.
You
Or they're
know,
following some Instagram.
why are you bench pressing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Most
So
people don't need to bench press.
man, that's actually very big truth. I think like it's we're influenced a lot by the basic things that we might know growing up and going to high school and like going through powerlifting classes and things like that, and you just
Sure.
know these few lifts that you're comfortable with, right? But it's not always
Totally.
ideal. No, I
Yeah.
hear
I
you.
mean, if every year your favorite time of year is like ski season,
Mhm.
bench pressing is not helping you out, right? Like you should be doing single leg hops
Mhm.
and standing on unstable surfaces and building your cardiovascular engine so you're not tired halfway through the day.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
getting back to that why are you training?
Mhm.
That was sort of the original mission statement for my business, Stronger in
Mhm.
Motion, was fitness with purpose. I think
Mhm.
most people are practicing fitness or they're on their fitness journey for its own sake, which is great for health. It's certainly better than being sedentary. But once you set a goal, then your plan has to be more specific to that goal.
Right. Not you don't want all the useless pieces that are just wasting your energy. Again, like the sprinter and aerobic example, right? It's
Sure.
just
If your goal was to be a world class sprinter and you just figured, running 5 miles a day was going to get you there, like you're gonna fail your goal, and then you're probably going to assume that any kind of working out is probably not going to work. You
right.
know, so as soon as you set a goal, I mean, when you set a goal, you're giving yourself a metric for success, but you're also now opening yourself up to like objective failure.
Mhm.
If your goal is just to go to the gym 3 days a week, like that's relatively simple. But if your
Mhm.
goal is to go to the gym 3 days a week, add 5 pounds of muscle, and lose 10 pounds of body fat, and
Mhm.
6 months later you look in the mirror and you're exactly the same, but you went to the gym 4 days a week, clearly the gym doesn't work. But you may have
Mhm.
been doing all the wrong things.
Mhm. Yeah, I hear you now. Now, going back to injuries a little bit, and
Yes.
we talked about different things you can do when you're faced with an injury, faced with a setback. But I mean, obviously, people listening are kind of maybe freaked out about having an injury now. What would you do? What would you ask them to incorporate to mitigate injury, to prevent it from happening all in the first place? What do you like to look for before these major lifts, or just general exercises they do throughout the day, general practices they have?
Sure. General practices, the big rocks that everyone talks about. Are you sleeping? Are you drinking some water or enough water? Is your nutrition, 75, 80% solid? Um, what are where would you rate your stress? That's one of the things we put on our intake form for Stronger in Motion is, where would you rate your stress day to day is just 0 to 10, and then that gives me I can follow up on that in detail with a client or a patient. Those are the biggest things. Those are all predictors of injury. It's the cup analogy. The more is your cup literally overflowing,
Mhm.
and can we either remove some things from the cup or do we need to get you a bigger cup? There's two options. But then just generally, I think no one there's almost no one who's going to have an adverse effect from trying to get 8 to 10,000 steps per day. Just and you can break that up however you want. It doesn't have to be 10,000 in a row, but just that gives you an impetus to move. I read this article a couple weeks ago, and there's a book coming out called Exercised, And it's about how we did not, as human beings, we did not evolve to exercise, right? We evolved actually to do the opposite because life was so physically demanding up until the last 100 years. There was like any opportunity you had to rest was just golden. And they've done some research on, the few hunter gatherer tribes that still exist in the world, and then research on just kind of like the skeletal remains of hunter gatherers from history. So before the pandemic, the average American got about 4,000 steps per day. And looking at current and previous hunter-gatherer societies, throughout most of human evolution, we were 12 times as active as we are now.
Oh, wow.
And like, I guarantee you, most human beings a couple thousand years ago did not have chronic low back pain. We were literally either hunting, climbing, running, walking, digging, raising children, defending ourselves. Life was movement. So trying to get more movement in your life is just number one, 100%. And then the other thing I would tell people is just try and have some variability. And that I kind of promote in two forms. Like, one would be, picking one day a week. If you're someone who goes to the gym, one day a week could be your single leg and single arm day. Or it could be the day where you're really going to prioritize moving sideways and rotating. You've got your lateral lunges and your med ball throws and your hopping side to side, or even just taking a cable and doing like chops. Something where you're not moving front to back sagittal plane, because life exists mostly now in the sagittal plane. And then if you want something a little more macro, then I like to talk to people about, can you kind of break your life? Can you break your year down into seasons like an athlete would? So I had one client that this was really effective with, because he lived in Northern California as a friend out there, and he loved to spend the summer. As soon as the weather got nice, he was on his bike, road biking and mountain biking. And so I was like, well, let's take the fall when it starts to rain, and let's work on, he's just tons of endurance, right? Tons of endurance in a relatively fixed position. He's sitting down or standing up with his feet in the pedals. So like, let's take the fall and try and just move sideways, get you off the bike altogether, work on single leg balance, work on single arm, like upper body in general, but single arm pressing, all the things that get you out of that cycling position. So you have your in season, right? His summer is in season for him, biking. His fall is off season, which is partially recovering from biking and just doing anything but biking. Then the winter, right? We're starting to move towards the preseason again, still off season, but like, let's start working on strength. You're not on the bike, but let's start thinking like, what would make you a better cyclist? How would you get up a hill better? Quad development, calves, getting your anterior tib, the muscles that hold your toe up when you're stuck in those clips and pulling. Your biking is pushing, but if you're in clips, it's also pulling your toes up on the pedals. Let's start working on that in the gym. And then we've got preseason, and we're going to start to build your endurance, right? We're going to start doing aerobic stuff, maybe getting on the bike a little bit. And I think most people could break their year down like that. My mom in Portland, Oregon, when the weather's nice, she's in her garden. Like, she's doing tons and tons of yard work. And so if she spends all winter just sitting, that first day where she goes out with a shovel, like, that's going to crush her. But you could use the gym to train for gardening season. So I think if people could think about if they could kind of seasonalize their year and even break it down, into 3 or 4 compartments, give you variety and purpose to what you're doing exercise wise.
I really love that analogy. I think it's very practical for a lot of people and changes the perspective from this is what I'm doing right now and I should continue doing this to what does the big picture look like and how can I make my whole life better in separate ways. You're not trying to accomplish everything all at once. You're building up to it consistently.
Yeah, and that's like a perfect little opportunity to like pitch the value of coaching, to have someone help you figure out like, oh, I really like this idea of breaking my year down into seasons, but if I garden in the summer, what the heck am I supposed to do in the winter so that I'm a better gardener and I don't I don't have to take 2 days off after every one day I spend out in the garden. Like that's where you and I and other people come into play. It's not
Right.
that you need to work with us all year, right? It's, imagine 5 sessions to just brainstorm and talk about training principles and all that kind of stuff, like how valuable that would be.
Right. Again, because you're trying to teach them and show them something that they normally don't do, right? That's the purpose of the off season aspect of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now,
And
like,
then
this is a whole new world.
make them an autonomous performer, basically.
Yeah. They'll be their own coach at that point. After that, they know what to do.
Yeah. Until their goals change, right? And then they just come on back and we figure that out. It's like, okay, my yard is in perfect shape. I think this summer I want to go hiking. Like I used to hike 20 years ago, and like, now my kids are old enough that we can go hiking together. Like that's very different than, shoveling and grabbing a grub hoe and trying to change out the layout of your backyard.
And now the goals in season, off season, all of it shifts as it goes on.
Yep.
So it's a
training for gardening and training for hiking, not the same.
Oh, nice. I like that. No, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. I really appreciate having you on here and sharing all the honestly really wonderful knowledge that you have about the human body as a whole. Where can people find you for more of your stuff and what you do? I know you mentioned a little bit of it earlier, but let's have it all in one place right here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very active on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. David Skolnik DPT. The DPT stands for Doctor of Physical Therapy. My business is Stronger in Motion. So strongerinmotion.com. There's also a separate Instagram page at Stronger in Motion. And then my podcast is called The Essential Strength Podcast. And we release new full-length episodes every Wednesday, typically interviews. And that podcast really just explores strength in its many forms. So, recently we've had someone come on to talk about how strength training helped them overcome alcohol addiction and what strength means to them now. We've had PhD in behavioral science, talking about literally talking about like how does willpower work in your brain. Physical therapy professors, business owners, professional fighters. In my opinion, strength is just an essential asset to have to be successful in life. And so it's been really fascinating to have each guest come on and give their personal definition of strength and see how that differs, but also is similar from someone who's, again, someone who's a college professor versus someone who's a UFC fighter. So yeah, the Essential Strength podcast, that comes out every Wednesday. So I think those are the three big ones. My personal Instagram, Stronger in Motion, and the Essential Strength podcast.
Yeah, awesome.
And obviously, if you're a power lifter in Phoenix, Arizona, hit me up. I'm at American Raw Fitness in Gilbert.
Yeah, this is the man to go to if you're in Phoenix. But man, I really loved what you had to say about your podcast. But now I have one question for you as a guest on my podcast to finish things off. So this podcast is called the Not So Stupid Podcast, and we focus on simplicity on your goal to success, right? As you strive for success. What are one or a couple simple things that someone can incorporate right after they listen to this that can really change their life, help them live a happier, healthier life for the better?
Okay, so you can walk more. You can get, 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Those are simple ones. And then one thing that for me, I think is more important is, can you in as many areas of your life as possible, can you sit down, can you write down what you're doing? And then next to that, can you write down why you're doing it? And if you can't identify why you're doing something that you're doing, then I think, the next question is, should I continue doing this? So I think the more you can have a why behind every what, the better off you're going to be.
Man, super simple, but that is really blowing people's minds right now. I'm sure that was powerful. I think that'll take, even though it took you 5 seconds to say those questions, it's going to take a long time to answer those for a lot of people.
Oh yeah. Simple is not easy.
Yeah, definitely not. Well, thank you so much, Dr. David. I really appreciate you hopping on the show, sharing your knowledge, everything, all of your contents are going to be linked in the show notes for everyone that wants to check it out. Follow David and listen to his podcast. But otherwise, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.